Industrial Revolution, so linen weaving was becoming an obsolete profession, and they fell into very deep poverty while they were in Scotland. He decided, he did not decide, his mother decided that they were going to move to Pittsburgh and essentially try to restart as a family because they had become so poor. He had 5 years of formal schooling, and that was it. But he continued his own education as a self-starter by borrowing books from wealthy people in Scotland because public libraries didn't exist at the time. And then as he came to the United States, he did not get to continue his schooling because he had to go to work right away to help support his family. So he started working in a linen factory, earning $1.20 a week. He then moved on to a telegraph office where people started to realize that even with minimal schooling, he was extremely intelligent. He could decipher the Morse code even before the secretaries had deciphered it and translated it into words. He was just by ear able to do so. Then he started working for the railroad company, which was kind of his most important job because this is where he noticed a hole in the market and decided to invest in all of the natural resources that were needed to build the railroad, most notably steel. He started to invest in iron ore and other oil along those lines as well. But steel was really where his fortune came. He founded the Carnegie Brothers Steel Corporation, and over time it became one of the two largest steel corporations in the country, in addition to Bethlehem Steel, also located in Pennsylvania. And by 1901, he had kind of amassed an empire in steel. At that point, J.P. Morgan decided that he was going to make Carnegie an offer to buy Carnegie Brothers Steel Corporation. I've heard different figures, but it's always somewhere between $350 and $450 million in 1901 currency. This is about $15 or $16 billion today, and so that made Carnegie the wealthiest man in the world. He chose to sell in 1901. He lived for 18 more years, and over the course of those 18 years, he gave away 90% of his wealth. He used it to fund 7,500 public libraries, going back to his time borrowing books from people in Scotland. He had a deep love for pipe organs, so he donated 2,800 pipe organs to schools and churches all over the country. He helped to fund the Peace Palace at The Hague, which I think is really interesting. And by the time 1919 rolled around, Carnegie ended up passing away of pneumonia as the official cause of death, but there's a lot of speculation from biographers that he actually had probably fallen into a deep depression over World War I, and that had been what triggered the pneumonia, because he was a pacifist. So come 1919, there was some question about what would happen to Carnegie Hall and whether it would stay standing. Louise Whitfield inherited the hall from Andrew, and she maintained ownership of it until 1925 when she sold to Robert Simon and the Simon family. They were real estate developers, so there was a lot of concern about whether the hall would be maintained as a music hall. Louise kind of knew that this might be the case, so she built into the contract that they had to maintain it as a music hall for 5 years. After that, they could do what they wanted with it. Luckily for us today, the Simon family was huge patrons of the arts. They loved this hall as a music hall. They chose to maintain it until 1957. This is when the city of New York announced that that Lincoln Center would be built at 65th and Broadway, and that with that, the New York Philharmonic would be moving uptown to perform at Lincoln Center. The New York Philharmonic was Carnegie Hall's #1 renter at the time, and they rented 1/3 of all possible dates. So this kind of spelled disaster for Carnegie Hall, and the Simon family decided they would not be able to afford to keep it functioning as a music hall. They were going to tear it down and sell it to someone who wanted to build office spaces. There were plans drawn up to build really, really, really ugly, garish red office complexes that were like truly the color of the sea on your sticker. I will show you a photo of it in the museum. It looked like an ant farm. It was quite ugly. That fortunately fell through, and Isaac Stern, who the auditorium is named after, stepped to the forefront and said, we need to save Carnegie Hall. He and his wife Vera lobbied to the city. They raised $5 million, which allowed the city to purchase Carnegie Hall from the Simon family, setting up as a national historic landmark, thereby preserving the hall, and that established the Carnegie Hall Corporation, which now operates the hall as a nonprofit, and now the hall cannot be torn down. But thankfully for us, the hall is still standing, even though there were some questions about whether that would be the case. we're gonna go ahead and head on into the hall.